April 3, 1943. Bethpage, Long Island. The rain hammered against the corrugated metal roof of the Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation. Inside, the air was a mix of cigarette smoke, hot metal, and tension. The Pacific War was swallowing lives and machines faster than America could replace them, and somewhere between the clatter of typewriters and the roar of rivet guns, a 27-year-old draftsman named Rosie Farrar leaned over a massive sheet of vellum. Her pencil trembled slightly as she traced the faint curve of a wing. Not just any wing, the F6F Hellcat, the Navy's next great hope to challenge Japan's Zero. Around her, the design room buzzed with urgency. Engineers in rolled-up sleeves argued over lift coefficients and landing stresses, their voices bouncing off the steel beams. Every hour mattered. Every line on paper could mean life or death for a pilot halfway across the Pacific. But Rosie's mind wasn't on thrust or armor plating. It was on a problem no one wanted to solve. The Navy's carrier decks were running out of space. The sleek new Hellcat was powerful, but its broad wingspan made it nearly impossible to store in numbers. Only a handful could fit on a carrier at once, a logistical nightmare when every sortie counted. The brass wanted more planes in the air, not more excuses. So Rosie stared at the drawing, tapping her pencil against the fuselage line. The wing had to fold, but how could you make a steel wing hinge without compromising its strength at 400 miles per hour? Every prototype had failed. Every engineer had shrugged and said it was impossible without weakening the frame. She didn't believe that. Not yet. Her father had been a machinist. She'd grown up listening to the rhythm of lathes and presses. She knew that sometimes the solution wasn't about building more muscle, it was about designing with grace. Outside, thunder cracked over Long Island. Inside, she erased a line, drew another. Her hand moved quickly now, a curved joint, offset pivots, a locking mechanism that didn't rely on brute force but balance. A wing that folded inward like a bird tucking itself for sleep. She paused. The rain softened. And for the first time in weeks she smiled. The next morning, she brought the sketch to her supervisor, a wiry man named Ed Chalmers, chief structural engineer for the Hellcat program. He barely looked up from his paperwork when she entered. "Sir," she said, voice steady but small, "I think I've found a way to make the Hellcat's wings fold without adding weight." He sighed, adjusting his glasses. "We've been through this, Farrar. Every hinge proposal compromises rigidity under stress." "I know," she said, sliding the blueprint onto his desk. "But this one doesn't." Chalmers frowned, eyes scanning her diagram. There was something there in elegance he couldn't dismiss outright. A pivoting spar that rotated on dual axes, supported by an internal brace instead of an external hinge. It shouldn't work. And yet, maybe it could. "Who helped you with this?" he asked quietly. "No one," she said. "It came to me last night." The room fell silent except for the ticking of a wall clock. He studied her face for a moment, then the sketch again. "Run a mock-up," he said finally. "Let's see if your miracle holds up to steel." Rosie didn't breathe until she was back in the drafting bay. Her hands were shaking. Not from fear, from adrenaline. For the first time, her idea was alive. But she had no idea how much resistance it would meet, and how close her innovation would come to being buried forever. The Grumman test hangar was hot enough to blur the air. Sparks flashed from welding torches. A skeletal Hellcat prototype sat in the center like some metallic beast mid-surgery, ribs exposed, cables hanging loose, wings half-fitted with temporary mounts. Rosie Farrar stood a few feet away, clutching a clipboard so tightly her knuckles whitened. Around her, the senior engineers circled like vultures. None of them said it aloud, but she could feel their skepticism. A girl draftsman proposing a fix to one of naval aviation's hardest problems? It was a joke to most of them. Ed Chalmers broke the silence. "All right, let's run Farrar's fold test. Keep clear of the hinge line." A mechanic in grease-stained coveralls nodded, positioning himself by the hand crank connected to the mock-up's hinge assembly. The steel groaned as tension built. Rosie's design depended on the dual pivot brace aligning perfectly, one fraction of a degree off, and the wing would twist, buckle, or shear. The crank turned once. Twice. Then, with a soft click, the massive wing began to fold inward, smooth as clockwork. No grinding. No stress fractures. No warping. The room froze. "Hold it!" Chalmers barked. The mechanic stopped immediately. He crouched, flashlight sweeping across the hinge joint. No cracks. The internal spar held steady under load. He looked up. "Run it again." The mechanic reversed the motion. The wing unfolded, locked perfectly into place. Chalmers exhaled slowly. "Do it one more time." Click. Folded. Clack. Locked. The engineers exchanged glances, disbelief mixing with reluctant admiration. Someone muttered, "I'll be damned." Rosie didn't move. She couldn't. She just stared at the hinge, her hinge, performing flawlessly under real stress. The design worked not because of brute strength, but because of balance. The stress distributed along the brace like a dancer shifting weight between steps. For the first time, she allowed herself to smile. Chalmers straightened, rubbing his temples. "Farrar, you just gave us another squadron per carrier," he said quietly. "Maybe two." Her breath caught. "Sir?" He gestured at the wing. "You've just solved the Navy's biggest storage problem. If this scales, it'll change everything." But not everyone was ready to celebrate. 2 weeks later, during a board review with Navy liaisons, Rosie's name wasn't mentioned once. The chief designer presented her mechanism as a Grumman structural innovation. Her blueprint had been redrawn, her initials erased. She sat in the back of the room, silent. Watching her work earn polite applause, for someone else. When the meeting ended, Chalmers found her outside, standing in the wind by the hangar doors. "I didn't know they'd cut your credit," he said. She looked down, hands in her pockets. "It's fine, sir. The design works. That's what matters." He frowned. "No, Rosie. You did something none of us could. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." She nodded, but the words rang hollow. In the distance, the test pilot throttled up a Hellcat engine, its roar filling the air. The wing folded and locked just as designed, the aircraft ready to be hauled onto the carrier deck. Rosie watched it disappear down the taxiway. June 19, 1944. Philippine Sea. The morning sky shimmered like glass, pale, endless, deceptive. Below it, the U.S. Navy's Task Force 58 carved through the ocean, carriers stretching to the horizon like floating cities. The air reeked of salt, fuel, and sweat. Hundreds of F6F Hellcats lined the decks, wings folded neatly in rows, so many that an officer once joked, "You could walk across the Pacific on them." That was Rosie Farrar's hinge at work. But she wasn't there to see it. Thousands of miles away, in that same Bethpage factory, she was bent over a new drawing, unaware that her quiet innovation was now helping win one of the largest aerial battles in history. On board the USS Lexington, Lieutenant Alex Vrashu checked his ammunition belts and glanced at the horizon. Radar had just picked up a swarm of Japanese aircraft, more than 400 inbound. The Americans called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, though there was nothing funny about it then. It was chaos waiting to unfold. "Wings out!" the deck chief yelled. Crewmen sprinted between aircraft, unlocking latches and releasing the folding mechanisms. In one synchronized motion, hundreds of Hellcats unfurled their wings, clack clack clack, like steel birds stretching awake. The noise rippled down the deck, mechanical, rhythmic, alive. "Lock secured. Fuel check complete. Launch sequence in 30 seconds. Without that folding system, half those planes wouldn't even be on deck. There wouldn't have been room. The Air Group Commander, David McCampbell, would later say, "We could fight with numbers the Japanese couldn't believe." The first Hellcats thundered down the deck, wheels lifting into the humid air. Then another. And another. Within minutes, the sky was full of blue-painted aircraft, diving, climbing, rolling, Hellcats against Zeros, machine guns chattering like furious applause. From the carrier's bridge, Rear Admiral Mark Mitchell watched through binoculars. He'd seen the Navy evolve from canvas biplanes to these rugged steel machines, and he knew what he was witnessing now wasn't just courage. It was design, engineering, logistics, the invisible miracles that kept nations alive. He turned to his flag captain and said quietly, "This is why we win." Hours later, when the battle smoke cleared, the sea was littered with wreckage, almost all Japanese. The Americans had destroyed more than 350 enemy planes for the loss of fewer than 30. The Hellcat had dominated the skies so completely that even Japanese ace pilots called it a monster. In the official reports, the folding mechanism was listed simply as Model F6F structural feature, carrier storage optimized. No one mentioned Rosie Farrar. Not once. But that day, her hinge allowed hundreds of fighters to launch, refuel, and rearm at a pace the enemy couldn't match. Her sketch, drawn in a thunderstorm on Long Island, was now shaping the war's outcome across an ocean. As night fell over the fleet, the carrier decks glowed under dim red lamps. Mechanics wiped oil from their faces, pilots slumped in exhaustion beside their planes. The folded wings loomed above them like steel angels. Somewhere on a carrier radio, a voice crackled through the static. "Hellcats to control, mission complete. Deck packed tight, sir. Couldn't have fit another bird if we tried." The officer chuckled, not realizing the truth behind his words. Back in Bethpage, Rosie looked up from her drafting table, sensing something, a tremor in the war effort, a victory she couldn't name. She rubbed her eyes, unaware that right then, halfway across the world, men were alive because her blueprint had worked. But the war wasn't over. And her design, like the woman herself, was about to be forgotten, buried beneath the myths of generals and machines. August 1945. Bethpage, New York. The war was finally ending. Sirens blared, factory whistles screamed, and confetti littered the streets of Manhattan. In the Grumman plant, workers cheered, kissed, and embraced, but the celebration felt distant to Rosie Farrar. She sat alone at her desk, staring at an official Navy bulletin tacked to the wall. It praised the superb engineering and design excellence of the F6F Hellcat, a machine credited with securing the Pacific and earning the title, "The plane that won the war." Her design, her hinge, wasn't mentioned. Not once. Rosie traced her finger over the printed words, reading them again, slower this time, as if hoping she'd missed something. But the credit went to the company, to the executives, to Grumman's superior innovation. She sighed and leaned back in her chair. Outside her window, sunlight glinted off a row of disassembled Hellcat wings, their joints folded clean and seamless, just as she had drawn them 2 years before. In the hangar below, young mechanics in grease-smeared uniforms were still laughing, still proud. None of them knew her name. But every time they reached for that latch, every time those wings tucked perfectly into place, her fingerprints were there. That was enough. Or at least, that's what she told herself. 2 weeks later, an engineering officer from the Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics visited Grumman for a debrief. Rosie was there, quietly taking notes. When the meeting ended, he approached her, curious. "You were on the Hellcat team, weren't you?" he asked. "Yes, sir. Drafting division." He smiled faintly. "That wing system of yours saved us a fortune in deck space. Don't think that went unnoticed." Rosie blinked. "My system?" The officer chuckled, lowering his voice. "We all knew who designed it. Not everyone gets public credit, Miss Farrar. But the pilots knew. The Navy knew." He offered a polite nod, then walked away. Rosie stood there for a moment, speechless. It wasn't the recognition she dreamed of, but it was something far rarer. A quiet acknowledgement. A truth passed hand to hand in the ranks of those who'd lived because of it. That night she walked home under the warm glow of streetlights, her shoes tapping softly against the wet pavement. Victory banners fluttered from every lamppost, the words, "We did it," painted in bold strokes. She smiled faintly, thinking of all the people who had done something small but vital. The welders. The draftsmen. The unseen hands. She paused at the corner, looking up at the night sky, quiet now, peaceful. Somewhere out there, thousands of Hellcats were being towed back to port, their folded wings resting like tired soldiers. Each one carried her signature, not in ink, but in steel. In 1958, during a tour of the newly opened National Air and Space Museum Annex, a retired Grumman engineer stood beside an F6F Hellcat display. He pointed to the wing joint, explaining how a unique folding system had allowed American carriers to carry twice as many aircraft during the war. A young visitor asked, "Who designed it?" The engineer paused, then smiled. "Someone you've never heard of," he said softly. "A draftsman named Rosie. She drew it in pencil." And for a moment, in the hum of the museum lights, it felt as if the noise of the factory and the roar of engines echoed again, carrying her name across time. Rosie Farrar never became famous. She never sought credit. But her hinge, elegant, simple, and enduring, outlived them all. Because sometimes, the war isn't won by the ones we see. It's won by the ones who draw the lines no one else dares to imagine.